Perception is one of the most fascinating parts of psychology because it explains how we make sense of the world around us. Our brain doesn't simply record reality like a camera, instead, it interprets and organizes information in ways that help us survive and function. When we look at an object, hear a sound, or feel a touch, what we experience is not just raw data coming from our senses, it is a processed version shaped by certain principles. These principles are often called the laws of perception, and they explain why we see order, meaning, and structure even in random or complex patterns. Without these laws, the world would feel like a chaotic mix of colors, sounds, and movements with no clear boundaries. A classic way psychologists explain perception is through Gestalt psychology, which emphasizes that we tend to see things as wholes rather than isolated parts. Imagine looking at a dotted outline of a circle. Even if some parts of the outline are missing, you still recognize it as a circle instead of random dots. That's because your brain fills in the gaps and organizes the visual input into a meaningful whole. This is one of the simplest examples of how perception works. Our mind applies built-in rules that help us recognize patterns and create coherence from incomplete information. The laws of perception are essentially shortcuts our brain uses to process massive amounts of sensory input quickly and efficiently. One important principle is the law of proximity, which states that objects close to each other are perceived as belonging together. Think about sitting in a classroom where students are spread across the room. If two students sit near each other, you are more likely to see them as a pair or a part of a group compared to students sitting farther apart. This simple rule helps our brain organize visual scenes by grouping elements that are spatially close. Proximity is also why design layouts or advertisements often cluster information in certain areas to guide attention and create an impression of unity. Another principle that shapes perception is the law of similarity. Our brain tends to group things that look alike, whether in color, shape, size, or texture. For example, in a sports match, even if hundreds of people are on the field, you can quickly separate one team from another because of the similarity of their uniforms. Similarly, when looking at a spreadsheet filled with numbers, your eyes naturally notice patterns if certain rows are highlighted in the same shade. This law is useful because it allows us to categorize and simplify information at a glance, saving time and mental energy. Closely related is the law of continuity, which reflects our brain's preference for seeing smooth, continuous patterns rather than abrupt changes. When you see a curving line partially covered by another object, you still perceive it as one continuous line instead of disconnected segments. Road signs, maps, and even graphs rely on this principle because it allows us to follow paths and trends with ease. Another fascinating aspect of perception is the law of closure, which describes how we tend to fill in gaps in incomplete figures to see a whole object. Imagine a broken circle drawn with small gaps. Most people still recognize it instantly as a circle, not as separate arcs. This ability is not just a visual trick, it reflects how our mind prefers completeness and order. It also explains why we can read sentences with missing letters, or why logos with partial designs still appear recognizable. Closure is a powerful tool in branding and design, but it also plays a role in memory and daily interactions, because our mind often completes stories or situations when we don't have all the information. The law of figure ground highlights how we separate an object from its background. A famous example is the vase face illusion, where you can either see two faces looking at each other or a vase in the center, depending on what you treat as the figure and what you see as the background. This principle operates constantly in everyday life. When you focus on a person speaking in a noisy room, you are mentally treating their voice as the figure, and the surrounding chatter as the ground. This law helps us direct attention, prioritize information, and reduce confusion in environments full of competing stimuli. Another rule often overlooked but equally important is the law of symmetry. Humans naturally perceive symmetrical objects as organized and harmonious. Symmetry makes perception easier because it suggests stability and balance. That is why so much of architecture, design, and even human attraction relies on symmetrical patterns. People often perceive symmetrical faces as more attractive because our brain associates symmetry with health and genetic fitness. The law of common fate adds a dynamic dimension to perception. It states that objects moving in the same direction are perceived as part of a group. Picture a flock of birds flying across the sky. Even though each bird is an individual, your brain groups them as one unit because they share the same movement. This principle is crucial in sports, traffic, and even social situations because it allows us to detect patterns of coordinated motion and anticipate outcomes. It also influences how we interpret human behavior. If several people turn their heads in the same direction, you instinctively follow, assuming they are responding to something significant. These laws don't operate in isolation. They interact and overlap, shaping perception in complex ways. When you look at a crowded street, for instance, you don't consciously apply proximity, similarity, and continuity one by one. Instead, your brain applies them simultaneously, allowing you to make sense of the scene quickly. You might group people walking together as families, recognize cars by their uniform shapes, and track moving objects smoothly across your field of vision, all without deliberate effort. These laws are automatic, efficient, and deeply ingrained in the way our nervous system processes information. What makes the laws of perception especially interesting is how they reveal the constructive nature of our experience. Perception is not a perfect reflection of reality. It is an interpretation shaped by our brain's tendencies and expectations. This explains why optical illusions can trick us so easily. They exploit the very principles that normally help us navigate the world, showing that our brain favors meaning and patterns over raw accuracy. While this may sometimes mislead us, it usually serves us well because it allows for quick, adaptive responses in a complex environment. Real-life applications of these principles are everywhere. In education, teachers use proximity and similarity when designing worksheets, so students can easily follow instructions. In marketing, brands use closure and symmetry to create memorable logos. In technology, user interface designers apply figure ground and continuity to make apps more intuitive. Even in everyday social life, these laws help us interpret body language, recognize group dynamics, and make sense of crowded environments. In short, understanding perception is not just an academic exercise, it has practical value in improving communication, design, and awareness of how our minds work. When you step back and reflect, it becomes clear that these laws highlight an important truth. Humans are not passive observers of the world, but active interpreters. We don't just see what is out there, we see what our brain organizes and emphasizes. This ability to impose order, find patterns, and construct meaning is what allows us to function effectively in a world that is often ambiguous and overwhelming. The laws of perception show us that our mind is constantly working behind the scenes, shaping reality in ways we often take for granted. By recognizing these laws, we can better understand not only how we see the world, but also how others might perceive it differently. Two people looking at the same situation may group, emphasize, or complete the information in different ways, leading to different interpretations. This awareness can improve empathy, communication, and problem-solving, because it reminds us that perception is shaped by universal principles but also influenced by context and personal experience. In psychology, this understanding deepens our appreciation of how the mind transforms raw sensation into meaningful experience. This ability to impose order, find patterns, and construct meaning is what allows us to function effectively in a world that is often ambiguous and overwhelming. By recognizing these laws, we can better understand not only how we see the world but also how others might perceive it differently.